Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to our Bede lecture. And we have the very great privilege and pleasure this year of having Abbot Jeremias Schröder to give the lecture. He is the Abbot Primate of the Benedictine Confederation. Very busy man. Last week in Russia, next week in Bavaria, which is close to home, isn't it?
It is home.
It is home. So he's a very mobile person, but I'm glad he's taken this opportunity to come and give our Bede lecture this year, which is usually on a liturgical subject. So thank you very much indeed. After the lecture is concluded, I'll say a few more words, and then you're all invited to tea at the Benedictine Institute. And to get there, you follow Brother Eli, who's greeted you when you came in. Brother Eli is from Lebanon, so he'll not get lost even in London. Thank you all very much indeed for coming, and we now invite Abbot Jeremias to give the lecture. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. I appreciate your presence on a beautiful summer day, to put it mildly. And I confess that I find it both an honor but also a somewhat daunting prospect to be here today to deliver the Bede lecture. Because the supposed content of these lectures places me on slightly uncertain ground. I've been asked to speak on a liturgical subject to an English audience. And I cannot claim to be English, obviously, nor am I a liturgist. My qualifications, therefore, are rather slight. I can only hope that these deficiencies may be compensated by one modest advantage. As a Benedictine from outside of England, I have had the privilege of discovering many of the figures and controversies that I want to speak to you about without having grown up with them. And occasionally, a foreigner, a stranger, notices things that are too familiar to those who belong to a certain tradition that they almost disappear from view for them. And if that happens once or twice this afternoon, then my presence here will perhaps have been justified after all. Part 1, Conquest, Reform, and the Bones of Contention, which, as you may have read, is the title of this conference, Bones of Contention, Reform under Norman Power. And such a story has to begin inevitably in 1066. And I want to follow, first of all, a well-established traditional narrative about the sequence of events before bringing in more recent scholars who complicate the older narrative, muddying the crystal beauty of a nice story with their detailed, recent, substantial scholarship. The Norman conquest transformed England with astonishing speed. A new king occupied the throne, a new aristocracy held the land, castles rose across the landscape, and before long the English church too acquired a new face. One bishop after another was replaced. Great monasteries received Norman abbots. The cathedral chapters were reorganized. Stone churches replaced older buildings, and with remarkable confidence, the conquerors set about reshaping the life of the church of this kingdom. Few figures embody this transformation more completely than Lanfranc. Lombard by birth, monk and abbot of Le Bec in Normandy and Saint-Étienne first, and later Archbishop of Canterbury. He combined intellectual distinction with formidable administrative gifts. If William the Conqueror gave England a new political order, Lanfranc gave it a new ecclesiastical order. A few archbishops have left such an immediate mark upon the institutional life of the English Church. His influence reached every aspect of church government. Bishops were replaced, monasteries reorganized, councils convened, discipline tightened. England was no longer merely governed by Norman rulers. Increasingly, it was prayed, administered, and thought about by Norman churchmen. For the invaders, this was the condition both of government but also of renewal. For the conquered, it felt like dispossession. Communities that had lived together for generations suddenly found themselves under unfamiliar leadership. Older monks saw customs disappear that they had known since childhood. Saints who had shaped the identity of a monastery were now presented in a different light. Feasts were dropped from calendars. Men who had once been respected advisors discovered that they no longer spoke the language, sometimes literally, often culturally, of those who now governed them. The conquest had entered the cloisters. Eadmer, somebody we will have to talk about later again and again, wrote, "Some of the customs which Lanfranc found in England had not yet found acceptance with him. So he changed many of them, often with good reason, but sometimes simply by the imposition of his own authority." What we benignly call monastic reform was often experienced as trauma by those directly affected by it. And that trauma showed. We have contemporary accounts of demonic possession and madness, of communities that no longer had a common language, of the disappearance of feasts and the disappearance of the relics of saints, the bones of contention of my title. And it may sound like a small matter, but if any of you have ever assisted at a liturgical dispute in a monastery, you will realize that it is not. And there were rebellions. The post-conquest period saw significant friction in English monasteries when newly appointed Norman religious leaders sought to reform or replace existing Anglo-Saxon traditions. There are some very vivid examples of this. There was a rebellion and an assassination plot at St. Augustine's Abbey in Canterbury. When the Archbishop appointed a new abbot, the monks violently defied the decision and ran away from the monastery rather than accept their new abbot. When Lanfranc coerced them to return, conspiracies continued, and one monk plotted to murder the new abbot. Lanfranc reacted with severe corporal punishment. He ordered that monk to be stripped naked, tied to the abbey gates, publicly flogged, and then banished with his head shaved. The fruit was not pacification. The resentment among the Anglo-Saxon monks ran deep. They revolted again and attempted to kill the abbot shortly after Lanfranc had died. Tensions were also high at Glastonbury, especially after the Anglo-Saxon abbot Aelfheah had been deposed. A Norman named Thurston from Caen in Normandy was appointed, and when he tried to force them to abandon their traditional liturgy and adopt new chants imported from Normandy, major conflict broke out. At Christ Church, the other bigger and more important monastery at Canterbury, there was unconcealed hostility between the native Anglo-Saxon monks and the newly arrived Normans. The old monks were described as overly secular. William of Malmesbury claimed they hunted with hounds, rolled dice, drank heavily, and dressed like laymen. Lanfranc used his own authority to alter and change their traditional customs and that brought about a lot of friction. There were language barriers. The French-speaking monks who had leadership roles could not yet communicate with the native English speakers. One Anglo-Saxon monk named Osbern, identified as a chief troublemaker, openly defiant to Lanfranc, was exiled to Normandy, to the Abbey of Le Bec, so that he should be disciplined and retrained by Anselm. We will hear more about him too. All this was part of an organized effort by William the Conqueror and Lanfranc to replace the Anglo-Saxon ecclesiastical elite with loyal Normans. Native abbots were removed without justification, simply to consolidate Norman power. Ordericus Vitalis wrote that native abbots were often terrified by secular threats and driven out unjustly, only to be replaced by Normans whom he described as tyrants rather than monks. Obviously, imposed change of leadership in a monastery is a major disruption. But some of the other changes mentioned here may appear trifling in comparison, but they are no trifling matter for monks. If you spend several hours a day in church, reciting and chanting, the manner how you do this matters to you. And conflicts can arise from this even when no conquest is involved. I recall an anecdote from a rather cultivated monastery in northern Germany not so long ago, a generation or so ago, where liturgical disputes ended up with books being thrown at each other in choir. This is obviously deplorable somehow, but those of you who are familiar with the inner dynamics of a monastic community under strain may be a little less surprised. St. Benedict in his rule finds it appropriate to remind the monks of the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not kill is quoted in the rule of St. Benedict as something even monks need to be reminded of from time to time. Don't be surprised if books start flying. It could be worse. The reforms, the trauma, and the conflicts were only one side of the story. But then there was also a productive response to this. A remarkable generation of Benedictine monks whose lives, whose choices and writings reveal how the Norman settlement was first contested, but then also interpreted and eventually absorbed into a new ecclesiastical identity. The towering figure who shapes and determines this next generation is Anselm of Canterbury. Many of you know that I come from an institution, Sant'Anselmo in Rome, that is dedicated to this great monk and scholar and archbishop, and I'm happy to be able to draw him into this conference. If Lanfranc shaped the institutions of the Anglo-Norman Church, Anselm shaped its intellectual and spiritual imagination. Unlike his predecessor, his influence was not exercised so much through legislation, but rather through teaching, preaching, and especially personal relationships. The principal Benedictine authors of the time all stood in close relation to him. Osbern, Gilbert Chrispin, who became abbot of Westminster later, Eadmer, the biographer of Anselm, Osbern, who had shared life with Anselm both in Normandy and at Christ Church in Canterbury. Through these three men, Anselm's influence went far beyond his own writings and helped to shape the historical memory through which later generations came to understand that period of the post-conquest church in England. Osbern he was an unruly monk at Christ Church, and Lanfranc exiled him to Le Bec so that he would be trained by Anselm there. When he came back, he discovered a literary vocation in preserving the memory of the great Anglo-Saxon saints, above all of St. Dunstan. His lives and miracle collections are not just acts of devotion, but really of historical remembrance. He made sure that even in the post-conquest period, monks and faithful alike would remember the great saints of the pre-conquest period. These saints became the guardians and guarantors of continuity. Their relics, their miracles, their liturgical cult preserved a memory that political events might have tried to erase. Gilbert Chrispin was born in Normandy, educated at Lebec too, and became abbot of Westminster. But for Norman, rather surprisingly, he developed a real intellectual curiosity, pastoral sensitivity, and an increasing appreciation of the English church in which he had come to serve. And thus the Norman reform through him began to acquire an English voice. The most important one is Eadmer, an English monk of Christ Church who lived through the transition from Anglo-Saxon to Norman Canterbury and became the closest companion and biographer of Archbishop Anselm. He was the most constructive author of this period. His loyalty to the English traditions of Canterbury never wavered, but neither did his devotion to the foreign archbishop whom he served. And it is through Eadmer that the older church found its most eloquent interpreter, and also that we know so much about Anselm, because he wrote about him assiduously. These Benedictines ensured that the English church did not lose its memory. Their works preserved the saints, recorded the translations of relics, recounted the miracles, and transmitted the stories that gave meaning to places and communities. They remind us that reform of this kind is not just a matter of documents, of statutes and councils. It needed to end up in the daily cycle of living, especially in the liturgy. That's where decisions were required, where issues had to be proposed, discussed, accepted, or rejected. And that touched all areas of liturgy and devotion, including the relics, the bones of my title, some of which were rejected at first, some lost, some removed, and some later returned. In the context of the relic stories of this time, there's the Latin word for invention, which is rather more ambivalent than its contemporary English meaning. Inventio in Latin is finding, discovery. It could also be an invention. There were bones of contention, in any case, who were being invented, found and discovered, perhaps occasionally invented, because they literally embodied the history, the identity, and the continuity of that church. The most famous relic story, I want to give only one, is that of, well, there are two actually. One recounted by Eadmer, who wrote that when Lanfranc was still alive, Osbern had investigated the cathedral's reliquaries in Christ Church and discovered a marvelous box filled to the brim. But struck by fear, he immediately closed this box again and abandoned his search. Years later, his conscience stirred, and he decided he had to bring this up again. And he interrupted Eadmer, who was writing at that time in the cloister, and told him that he had seen a box full of relics. Now, as through a dream, I see still what that box contained, he confessed. And he urged Eadmer and some other monks, sacristans, to return with him, lest the truth escape us for good. And then they found the box again, opened it, and inside they found an almost complete human skeleton, missing only a single bone of an arm. And then they discovered a small scrap of parchment stuffed directly into the skull. And according to that parchment, they could identify the relics as those of Saint Audoenus the Confessor, also known as Saint Ouen, Bishop of Rouen in the very early Middle Ages, an early medieval Norman saint, nothing less. It showed how the relics exercised fascination and how lost and discarded relics were being rediscovered. And in that case, of course, the discovery of the physical remains of a prominent Norman bishop also worked to connect Canterbury to the continent, to its customs and devotions there, helping in a way to bridge the gap between those saints who were traditionally Norman and those who were traditionally English. In a way, this is the story, told many times and most masterly by the great historian Richard Southern. Lanfranc came as a competent reformer who wanted to shape the church afresh. He could do so on the basis of his Norman experience, the latest cry in contemporary continental monastic practices and reform. He looked with suspicion and disdain on the older Anglo-Saxon traditions, sometimes throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Anselm, his successor, and his disciples managed to temper this reformist zeal, rolling back some of the more extreme and provocative reforms, beginning to reconcile the frustrated and bitter monks and ecclesiastics and faithful too, one dare say, by allowing the older saints and practices to shine again. That story is still quite present because it's a very good story. It has all the qualities. It has a beginning, a crisis, and a resolution. It has memorable personalities: Lanfranc the reformer, Anselm the theologian, Osbern the guardian of saints, Eadmer the faithful witness. It has tangible symbols, churches, shrines, relics, that make these historical developments visible. And it speaks of questions that remain immediately recognizable: conquest, identity, memory, reform, continuity, and change. Good historical narratives like this have a capacity to outlive the scholarship from which they have first emerged. They become part of a community's understanding of itself. They express something that feels true. I noticed this recently. I was discussing some of these stories with an Anglican Benedictine nun, and she told me that as an English woman, of course, she sympathized with the Anglo-Saxon monks against the Norman reformers. I found that quite remarkable, that almost 1,000 years later, she still felt herself to belong very clearly to one side of that story. And one could have argued that living in the 21st century is probably most ecclesiastics in England nowadays are the heirs of both these traditions and of this entire process, not just of one side. But it is still possible to identify, to embrace a story. When it's a good story, it can be done, and probably we all love doing it. This tendency may be helped by what I think is a very attractive trait of English historiography. It seems to me there is a difference of academic temperament on the two sides of the channel. English historical writing delights in a clear thesis, in an argument that can be followed and defended. That's what doctorates here are called, after all. They're called a thesis. German scholarship, by contrast, regards it as an achievement simply to have demonstrated that reality was considerably more complicated than anyone had previously imagined. The reader of English scholarship will, if he's lucky, reach the last page with a memorable conclusion. The reader of a German tome will often be left with a healthy respect for complexity. Truthful, perhaps, but not terribly nourishing for the soul. The older account, the account I've given you up to now about the Norman reform, has all those qualities of a good story that make a historical narrative persuasive. It is coherent, it identifies principal actors, It enables us to understand why emotions ran so high and why the memory of these events has endured for centuries. It occasionally may simplify the evidence a little bit, but it does so in the service of telling a story that is intelligible and deeply human. Well, now, that was the classical narrative. During the past several decades, the foundations of this account have been examined with great care. Liturgical books have been studied manuscript by manuscript, calendars compared, pontificals, the ritual books used in the cathedrals, other customary books have been analyzed with precision, in a way painstakingly that earlier generations could scarcely have imagined. And that has made the picture considerably more complicated in a sort of Germanic way. Many detailed studies have shown how even Lanfranc and those who helped him to bring about reform did use older Anglo-Saxon sources after all, maybe working on them, shortening here and there, bringing in a few new elements from the continent too, but in a much more balanced way than the older narrative suggested. The Norman Reform remains one of the great turning points in the history of the English Church. But it is not just simply the replacement of one ecclesiastical culture by another. It resembles a prolonged process of adaptation and mutual influence. And if one were to look for a single word that characterizes the fruit of this discovery of the more recent scholarship, it would probably be negotiation. The older story emphasized replacement. Norman bishops replaced English bishops. Norman abbots replaced English abbots. New churches rose over older foundations. Old books were thrown out, new books came in. The liturgical evidence, however, is much more subtle. It becomes clear that the change was less dramatic. Liturgical books were not simply discarded and replaced. Calendars continued to preserve the local saints. The benedictions, the collects, the chants survived across the conquest with surprising resilience. And even where revisions took place, they often consisted not of wholesale replacement, but of careful adaptation. The Norman reformers inherited far more than they abolished. And that shouldn't really surprise us, because institutions can perhaps be changed by decree, but the liturgy cannot. Liturgical practices have a tendency to survive above ground or underground. Eamon Duffy, in this seminal book of his, Stripping of the Altars, has given beautiful examples how even in post-Reformation England, for a long time, many older Catholic customs survived, how the older books continued to be used and so on. And the same seems to have been true at this period of the Norman conquest. Liturgy is not just found in books, it is written into life. And that's true of monastic life in general. Customs are learned not just from legislation, but really in the living together with older monks. They are transmitted in the choir, in the refectory, in the chapter house, in the countless small gestures that not always find their way into written sources. The Norman superiors did not simply interrupt one tradition and begin another. For many years, decades perhaps, English and Norman monks had to learn how to live together. And that's what we call negotiation. The Normans had political and institutional authority, but that alone does not create culture. The newcomers depended also on the memory, the experience, and the practical knowledge of the communities which they had inherited. The English monks, for their part, could not preserve their traditions unchanged, but they selected and adapted and reinterpreted them within the new institutional structure. The result was a church that amalgamated Anglo-Saxon traditions and Norman imports. An Anglo-Norman church came into being, formed through decades of accommodation, misunderstanding, compromise, but also sometimes genuine friendship. I'm actually skipping something here. The beautiful story of St. Aelfheah, the Archbishop of Canterbury, whom Lanfranc did not want to have in the calendar anymore because he thought he hadn't been a martyr. Anselm persuaded him with a theological argument that he is a martyr as well, and eventually he was brought back. And that was a great act of reconciliation for the community of Christ Church, first of all, but really for the whole of English Christianity at that time. We do realize that there was an emotional cost to this process. Reform can be traumatic. I've hinted at this already. We have similar stories from the continent in the same period, 11th and 12th century, where elderly monks, in the course of reform movements happening there, suddenly find themselves strangers within their own monastery, unsettled by new observances, convinced that the customs which had shaped their vocations are now quietly disappearing. The deepest wounds are rarely inflicted by great theological controversies. More often they arise from what seems to outsiders as almost insignificant details: the cut of the habit, the arrangements of the choir, the melodies of familiar chants, the order of processions, the customs that give rhythm to the monastic day. To a monk, such things are not peripheral. They are the very language through which we live our stability. There are many cases where this was done brutally, where reforms, also on the continent, were effected quite cruelly, telling the old community, you get one wing of the monastery, you do your own thing over there, whatever you want, you may no longer receive new young monks, we wait for you to die out, and then we take over the whole compound. The evidence from post-conquest England suggests a more nuanced picture. Conflict was real. There were moments of bitterness and misunderstanding, as I've mentioned before, but the sources also reveal something else. Communities that do continue to live together, old and new, learning, sometimes reluctantly, to share a common life. The newcomers depended upon the memory and experience of those already present. These anecdotes about saints, discovery of relics, talk about that. Older monks gradually accept practices and new leadership. It's not the victory of one tradition over another. It's a process of negotiation in which both sides are changed and eventually form a new one. I think there is something profoundly Benedictine about this. Our stability does not mean the absence of change. It means remaining together through change. And I think also there may be something peculiarly English in this process. A preference for accommodation over ideology, for practical compromise over abstract victory. It's a picture that is historically convincing and I would say also spiritually more attractive. The fact that something specifically Benedictine and specifically English comes together in this would make me want to discuss in more detail the question of causalities. Did Benedictine monasticism influence the development of Englishness? Or vice versa? Did Englishness influence how Benedictinism developed? A very similar argument could be made about my home country, Bavaria, which has also very profoundly been shaped, I believe, by Benedictine traditions. Perhaps we find another occasion to think about this on both sides of the Channel as we approach the milestone year of 2029, 1500 years since the establishment of Monte Cassino, and a moment of reflection for us Benedictines. But I digress. I'm coming to the last but one section of my talk, where I want to talk about friendship. If communities rather than institutions ultimately carried the Norman reform, one question comes up. What enabled this process of living together? And I think part of it is not in books and constitutions, but rather in people. There is an aspect of Anselm's personality that has long attracted the attention of his biographers. Richard Southern, more than anyone else, drew attention to Anselm's extraordinary gift for friendship. Southern regarded this not simply as an attractive feature of Anselm's character, but really as a key to understand the man himself. The evidence is well known. His letters reveal a man of extraordinary warmth and generosity, capable of forming deep personal relationships across every imaginable boundary, across countries, across time. He's maintained some of these friendships for decades. Monks, bishops, kings, queens, scholars, simple religious, all experienced him not merely as an authority, but as a friend. Few medieval churchmen seem to have inspired such lasting personal affection. None of this is new. All of this is found in scholarship. But I would like to suggest that this quality may really have helped to explain also part of this success of the post-Norman conquest negotiation of life between Anglo-Saxon and Norman monks. If reform can be lived as trauma, friendship may become one of the ways in which this trauma can be healed. The career of Osbern is an example. He was one of the most difficult personalities in Christchurch after the conquest. Immensely gifted, but deeply attached to the Anglo-Saxon traditions of Canterbury, capable of resentment, opposition to the new order. One could have just sent him away or sidelined him. But Lanfranc sent him to Lubeck, entrusting him to Anselm. And Anselm really, with his capacity for friendship, won this monk over. The one who had stood among the more difficult figures of the community became one of its most important and meaningful members. His literary gifts, instead of being employed against the reform, helped to preserve the memory of the Anglo-Saxon church within this newly growing Anglo-Norman church. A similar pattern is shown in the life of Eadmer. His loyalties naturally lay with the traditions of pre-conquest Canterbury, and yet he became Anselm's closest companion, secretary, and biographer. Their friendship made those differences fruitful. I find the idea suggests persuasive that Anselm's genius for friendship helped to shape the character of that stage of Anglo-Norman reform. It created relationships in which confidence could grow, memories could be honored and respected, and differences could be discussed without immediately becoming divisive. And I think there's a wider lesson here. This is a difficult one. When I discussed an early draft of this paper, actually with artificial intelligence, I discussed it with... at this stage here, I was told I should, under no circumstances, compare the liturgical reforms of the Second Vatican Council with the Norman Conquest. And so I'm not doing that at all. Please be advised. I'm not doing this at all. We often assume that conflicts are resolved principally through negotiations, institutions, or carefully designed procedures. And all these things matter. But anyone who has lived for any length of time in a monastery knows that it makes an enormous difference whether those who disagree have first learned to know and appreciate each other as persons, as confreres, as possibly even friends. Personal relationships do not abolish disagreement, but they do make it more difficult to turn disagreement into enmity. They keep open channels of communication long after official dialogue has become strained. One other small digression. I hope, and it is my experience, that Benedictines are not exclusively, but are in a special way capable of this kind of living diversity within a community, with respect and mutual appreciation. Father Abbott mentioned that I was in Russia last week, and that was actually precisely such a story. On the level of the highest leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church, there has been a breakdown of communications in the context of the Ukraine war because of things that had been said on both sides. And it seems very difficult right now to re-establish relations. And we Benedictines had been invited and encouraged from several sides if we might be the ones who can build a bridge, a relationship again with the Russian Orthodox Church by building on our monastic identity. Not to talk on the top level with the Patriarch, but really to create a contact, a dialogue, possibly even bonds with monks and nuns in the Russian Orthodox Church, a church in which monasticism plays a bigger role than it plays in ours today. And we Benedictines have been singled out for this because of the heritage of St. Benedict, because he is a saint who is venerated also in the Eastern churches, is found in their calendar, and because our way of life is compatible and understood in the Orthodox churches. And so we went last weekend for a few days, a group of abbots and an abbess, 3 nuns and 2 monks, some people who know a lot about Russia, thank God, some people who know nothing about Russia, that includes me. And it worked exactly as it had been hoped for. The monks and nuns received us with great generosity and relief that after several years when no Roman Catholics officially had visited the Russian church anymore, there was once again a possibility of dialoguing, because that church also realizes that it is somehow isolated and does want to be in touch, in communion with us. And so we have the impression that this journey that we undertook really is the beginning of a relationship where this Benedictine ability of building bridges and of cultivating friendship can, after all, be made useful for the church as a whole. In that context, I wonder if one of the greatest dangers of our time is not disagreement itself, but the gradual disappearance of personal encounter. We are so good at building walls between nations, between churches, political camps, within our own societies. And once relationships disappear, every disagreement risks becoming absolute. Anselm and his disciples remind us of another possibility. He seems to have understood that lasting reform requires more than sound institutions and correct ideas. It requires trust. And the strongest trust can be built on the kind of friendship for which Anselm was uniquely gifted. This was the last but one section. Now I come to the truly last one. I want to move beyond the bones and speak about one beautiful spiritual fruit of this whole process. Eadmer stands at the beginning of one of the most remarkable developments in medieval theology. He wrote a book on the conception of the Blessed Virgin Mary, in which he offered the earliest sustained systematic reflection on what will eventually become the teaching, the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. In doing this, he built on an older liturgical tradition that was threatened by the Normans and that he was able to bring back. He used some Anselmian ways of thinking in doing this. What is fitting for God, what is fitting for Our Lady as she's being prepared to receive the Son of God. And he gave a new expression to an intuition whose influence would eventually extend far beyond England. I would love to work on this in greater detail. But we have reached the end of the time allotted to me, and in this heat wave, perhaps also the end of your patience, so I will almost leave it there. But this feast, which had originally come from the Christian East, which was dropped by the Normans at first, but then was brought back, it was developed, and its thinking about it was developed by Eadmer in a beautiful way. I do not even want to talk about dogma and doctrine, because I find this takes away something, it makes it sound too dry. This is not an exercise in speculative theology. Eadmer does something, he creates something which is much more alive. It's about imagery and language. It's a language of grace and beauty that eventually inspires centuries of prayers, of devotion, of poetry and of art, before also then becoming dogma and theologically defined. I think that this fruit of post-conquest Anglo-Norman church life, the teaching, the imagery of the Immaculate Conception, is a beautiful coda to the story that I have tried to lay out for you here. This is not just a pendulum swinging between Anglo-Saxons and Normans, between reform and recovery. This is a process in which something genuinely new is allowed to grow. Out of conflict emerges not only compromise, negotiation as I called it, but creativity. The Church is enriched, not only in what she teaches, if you like, but also in the language with which she speaks, the images by which she imagines, and the spiritual imagination through which she contemplates the mysteries of faith. And if a period of strife, of conquest and violence can end by bearing fruit like this, then perhaps somehow it was all worth it too. Thank you very much.